Okay. Well, good morning or good night. I'm Alana Camassa, Vice Coordinator of the Laboratory of Studies on China's Political Economy, LabChina, and the Coordinator of the Laboratory for Studies on Asia, LabAsia. And today's lecture is part of a joint initiative developed by both laboratories. So for this seminar, we have the presence of two incredible professors, Professors Daya Thussu and Professor Pedro Guiar. And today, Professor Daya is going to talk about China and the changing geopolitics of global communication, BRICS and beyond. Daya Thussu is a professor of international communication at Hong Kong Baptist University. He is the president of the International Association for Media and Communication Research. He was for many years professor of international communication at University of Westminster in London. For the academic year of 2018-2019, he was distinguished visiting professor and inaugural Disney chair in global media at Schwarzman College, Tsinghua University in Beijing also. Professor Thussu is the author and editor of more than 20 books, including International Communication, Continuity and Change, and the most recently book, Changing Geopolitics of Global Communication. I would like to thank Professor Daya for his availability and willingness to participate in this seminar. And I also would like to present the Professor Pedro Guiar, who is going to be our discussant today. He is a journalist and journalism professor at Fluminense Federal University. He holds a PhD in communication from State University of Rio de Janeiro. He is a researcher in the research group on logics of production and consumption in journalism, and in the research group on information and communication policy and political economy. And in 2019, he received the Adelmo Genro Filho Award for Journalism Research in the doctoral category. And he also teaches courses on geopolitics of communication and international journalism. So I would like to thank Professor Pedro for your presence here today, especially considering that here in Brazil, we are in the middle of an extended holiday. I do believe that we will have a very insightful and productive discussion today. And I think that's it. Professor Daya, the floor is yours. Thank you very much again.
Thank you so much for that. Sorry, something happened. Thank you so much for your very generous introduction. I'm speaking to you from mainland China, so I had some difficulty initially to get connected, but now it seems to be okay, and I hope it stays that way till the end of the lecture. It's indeed a great honor and a privilege to speak to a group of scholars and students who are specifically working on Asia more broadly and China specifically. And China, as we all know, is a very, very important country in terms of almost every aspect of international relations, including geopolitics and that of global communication. So my theme for today's lecture is an attempt to study the changing contours of this whole geopolitical world and the role of China within it as the most important player. But also looking at it within the context of BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And I'm very pleased to be addressing an audience in Brazil, one of the founding members of this group of nations, and a very significant voice in terms of articulating a global South perspective on international affairs. Very distinct, I would say, perspective. So I will start with some reflections about the current order, which is traditionally, as we all know, dominated by certain countries and certain corporations based in those countries. And then I will move on to the change part. And in that part, I would initially talk about the BRICS, how BRICS have grown, expanded. And then within BRICS, China being the most important player, I will focus a lot more on China, given also the interest of people in this group. So a lot of what I'm going to speak about draws on my recent book. It's published late, actually about 25 on it, 2025, but actually was published last year. And the book is called Changing Geopolitics of Global Communication. It was published in a series called Communication and Society of Routledge, which is a very prestigious series edited by Professor James Curran, a very well-known communication media scholar and a historian by training. So what is special about this is it is the first book-length study which directly connects geopolitics and global communication. I should also mention that my academic background is in international relations. I have a PhD in international relations, and I've been teaching international communication for many years now. So I bring that kind of a mixture of international relations perspective into international communication field. What it does is sort of examines the changes, which is the bulk of what I'm going to talk about today, but also continuities that the US-led global geopolitics has experienced. At the same time, not only just how it is framed, but how it is communicated. Again, is a very well-established record of domination of certain countries, the way they frame debates about geopolitical issues, and then how these are communicated. And the title of the book, The Change, and the challenges that have been posed by the so-called the rest, rise of the rest. Now, any study of international relations or international communication within that broader field would suggest that there is a well-established US-UK domination of international news and current affairs, international entertainment, international discourse creation, etc. And there are reasons for that, and I don't think I need to go into any detail. It's well documented. A huge amount of literature exists on it. I've myself written extensively on that topic. And it has become even more pronounced in certain ways because in the digital age, a new level of this domination is visible. So, for example, if we look at these organizations, all well known, whether it is Meta or Microsoft or Google, they are now in their own right geopolitical actors. There's also, you would notice, TikTok and Alibaba in that illustration. So it's really relatively new phenomenon that unelected, hugely powerful, mostly California-based corporations have emerged as an important player in geopolitical discussions and policy making. And this is creating a lot of concerns in many quarters about what it means for democracy This is one example of that concern that was published last year, I think, or the year before, I think, by a well-known public intellectual policy person. She's now based in the US, but she's originally in Europe and has been very important in the European Union discourses about big tech and what it is doing to democracies, as the title of this book shows, the tech coup. And how to save democracy from Silicon Valley. Now, this is before Trump 2.0. This is before Elon Musk getting a salary package of $1 trillion. I mean, that's just astonishing fact that one individual has so much power. So it's not surprising that some scholars talk today about a new kind of imperialism, data imperialism. In my book, there is a whole chapter about what I call digital imperialism, whether it is data portals. People with longer memories would remember that in the 19th century, there was a news cartel, 3 news organizations, one British, one French, and one German, divided up the world of international news and controlled it for decades. So now you have data portals. Others talk about cloud empires. So your and my data, our pictures and our bank accounts, the details are up there. And it's not some divine entity. These are corporations who are making a huge amount of money by trading in this data. On top of that, what has emerged in the last few years is AI. I call it American intelligence, and you see all these top companies, some of these are actually a longer history. For example, Microsoft. Well, I remember a long time ago, I wrote something about Microsoft monopoly, because it had the monopoly of what kind of computer programs you could use. So, these are very well-known and exceptionally powerful organizations. I'll just pick one out of these because that's very relevant for AI discourse, which is NVIDIA. Last year, NVIDIA's market value was $5 trillion. One company, relatively new company, $5 trillion. That is only slightly lower than the GDP of Germany. The powerhouse of European Union, one of the strongest economies on the planet. And just imagine what Germans do, how many things they produce, in comparison to a company which is so specialized, but has so much market value. Of course, market values shift and change, but you get a sense of the scale of their power. So this is, I just wanted to put that out in the very beginning, that there is this whole tradition going back to the 19th century of certain kind of, as I said, very well documented domination and dependence. What has changed? And that's what I want to focus on, because that's the interesting thing and doesn't get as much sort of coverage or traction in scholarship, especially in the dominant regions of the world. And that is the rise of the West. Now, within that, of course, in my reckoning, the most important BRICS, which was BRIC initially, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, 4 major countries. South Africa was added on Chinese insistence later, and now we speak of BRICS Plus. It's also important to remind ourselves that BRICS as an idea came from Russia. And it has its origins are in the economic turmoil that the United States faced in 2007, 2008. And there was a reaction in many capitals that we cannot depend on the vagaries of American housing market. We need to think of alternatives. And the idea emerged from Russia, from China, appropriated it. To tell the West specifically, that look, don't get worried, there is other guys but also doing well, and they're going to balance it. So don't worry about other guys. That's just putting it crudely, but it summarizes in my point. Now, I had the great privilege to work on BRICS, especially BRICS media. I was involved in a major project that was based at the university in Finland. It was a Finnish Academy funded project. And we did a lot of work on BRICS media specifically. Here are the few publications that emerged out of that 4-year project. There were also many journal articles and conference papers, etc., etc. And I was directly involved in this, as you see, there are 3 books too. I was editor, co-editor, but I did most of that. The last book, BRICS Media, Reshaping the Global Communication Order, came out in 2021. And this was the COVID book for me. And as you see, there's a question mark at the end. Whether it is reshaping the global communication order. When this came out, a lot of my colleagues and friends and foes were saying to me, why aren't you flogging the dead horse? BRICS is a phrase which was coined by Goldman Sachs. It doesn't really mean anything. What is common between India and China, for example? So different. How does Brazil compare with Russia? South Africa is too small an economy to be part of this BRICS club. Right? And this is the kind of discourse you hear a lot about. That this is just a made-up word, it doesn't actually mean very much. But I was, and I am convinced that there was something in it because it represented important non-Western powers. And they were getting together and thinking about an alternative structure for global governance. I have to say I was proved right, because now we have BRICS Plus. Last year, many important countries joined it and made it from 5 to 10 members. This was the first expansion since South Africa joined in 2011, I think it was. Last year, Egypt joined, Ethiopia, Iran, United Arab Emirates. Actually, it's also your neighbor Argentina and Saudi Arabia. In Argentina, the change of government, and obviously they got a phone call from Washington and said, oh, we're not going to be part of this anti-Western alliance, which actually is not true. It's not anti-Western. Some members might be, but also Brazil, India, South Africa, they did that. They don't say that they are Western, anti-Western. And this year, another major country in Asia joined it, Indonesia. So we look at this list again. These are all in their own ways very important countries. You know, Ethiopia is where the African Union was located, where the headquarters is located. Iran is a very significant geopolitical actor, energy power. Egypt is arguably the most important country. In historical terms, in intellectual terms, there's a lot of history. And UAE has emerged as a very important hub for all kinds of geopolitical projects or infrastructure projects, or fintech or AI. And Indonesia is a very powerful, and not so economic terms, not that powerful, very resource-rich country, and also the world's largest Muslim population. And then you have partner countries: Belarus, Bolivia, Kazakhstan, Cuba, Malaysia, Nigeria, Thailand, Uganda, Uzbekistan, and Vietnam. Now, I have highlighted two there, Kazakhstan and Nigeria. And if you look at the first column, you also have Iran, Indonesia, and United Arab Emirates. Although UAE doesn't have much energy resources, but it's very central in the energy politics. So, and then of course you have Russia, and you have Brazil, which is also very well resourced in considering minerals and other resources. And then you have, at the same time, you have China and India, the world's two most energy-hungry nations, and very fast-growing economies. India is the largest growing, big economy in the world. It has been for some time. China is already the second largest in the world. So that offers very interesting realignment of global power structures. What is more interesting is, in recent years, some of these countries are trading in their own currencies. China is buying Iranian oil not using dollars. So there is a very big debate in Western capitals about what would that mean for the green currency. The debate of de-dollarization at its heart in these BRICS countries. Another international organization, which is very significant in terms of changing geopolitics, and doesn't get as much coverage, is Shanghai Cooperation Organization, another Chinese project. As I said before, BRICS was originally a Russian idea, but it was appropriated by China. China remains the most important player in that grouping. So the extension of BRICS, you can see a very important role of the Chinese government in pushing certain countries and blocking it. SCO is in operation much longer, 2001, and it was really a Chinese project to expand into energy-rich Central Asia. So all those towns are there, right? And of course Russia is in it. But the recent additions are India and Pakistan. China won't. India only if they allowed Pakistan to be a member. So it was a kind of, again, a local geopolitical game. And Iran has joined recently. And again, it's a big, important group. It became particularly newsworthy this year, in fact, in September, when these three leaders met in Tianjin, where the summit of SCO was taking place. It was the first time that President Putin was able to travel out of Russia, and he was the guest of honor at this event. And you see the picture of the Indian Prime Minister, the Chinese President, and the Russian President in one frame. And it became a much talked about picture. And the social media, all three leaders were pushing it to show that there is a new affiliation taking place. And, students of international relations would know it's not a new idea. Actually, it was, again, a Russian project in the 1990s after the Cold War ended, of RIC, Russia, India, China, idea of a Eurasian, kind of coming together of countries. Because remember, Russia is so a large part of Russia is in Asia, although the elitist part is European. So both BRICS and SCO you have very clear Chinese print. And it has used those associations, these forums, to promote, as have other countries, but it has more heft. So it has been able to, for example, BRICS Bank, which is a very important sort of alternative source of funding for many development projects, is based in Shanghai, and China has the largest sort of stake in it. But perhaps most importantly, China's attempt to create an alternative global infrastructure, but by way of the so-called Belt and Road Initiative, BRR, is again unprecedented. As you see on this map, which is I borrowed it from a German think tank who does specialist work on China, actually banned in China. Railroads, oil pipelines, gas pipelines, ports, etc. And both a land-based so-called Silk Road and a maritime Silk. There's also a polar road, Silk Road being mentioned. And although in this map you get a sense that this is really connecting Europe to Asia, in fact, the focus of BRR is not Europe. Very few European countries are members of it. Italy was the only G7 country who was member. They left it, so in the sense. The focus really is the global south. And just to remind our viewers, this has been going on since 2013. Already a decade. This is how the Chinese official media celebrated its 10 years in 2023. So here we're talking about trillions of dollars of investment. We're talking about 900 plus projects. We're talking about 150 countries being involved and many international organizations being involved. It's just the scale and the scope of what it is aiming to do, and what's some of it's already been done. But many of these projects are not really successful. An example would be Sri Lanka, for example, or Cambodia, and where it has gone very wrong. But just to get a sense, especially for students of politics and international relations, by way of comparison, I would encourage you to think about the Marshall Plan, which was an American project to rebuild war-torn Western Europe, not Eastern Europe, was Cold War. And so it was confined to a very limited area of the globe, in fact, limited area within Europe. And 70 years later, American imprint on European foreign policy, European defense policy, European popular culture, European intellectual work is profound. To then magnify that by 30 times, encompassing almost the entire globe, and then think what kind of impact would it have 50 years down the line. That's the planning. That's the long-term investment. The whole idea of global development initiative is part of the pyramid. And obviously it's creating a lot of ripples, especially in the development bureaucracy. Here are a couple of examples. You may know some of this work. Specifically, this one about BRI's Geopolitics, and this one about China creating a new world order through this infrastructure project. Because infrastructure is not just about building roads and bridges or airports, or providing satellite connectivity, which is all possible. But it is also then providing software. And China has been, as I said, doing this for over a decade now. But it's not really been received in the same manner. It's always, there are arguments about how it is creating a new kind of colonialism. Others are arguing this is a kind of debt trap. People, these poor countries who don't have that sophisticated systems of governments, they are now becoming, a kind of quasi allies of the colonies even of Chinese state. China has tried on the spot to assuage that feeling. They say, no, we're not doing it. We're doing it for, helping with the prosperity for all, harmonious society, etc. There's some set phrases. And the media is, I gave you an example earlier about how they marked 10 years of the era, is very keen to promote that line across the world. Here is a recent publication by a well-known American commentator who wrote a very famous book on this mostly journalistic account called China's Charm Offensive. A colleague in Beijing actually rebuts that and calls it charm defensive. We are being defensive, we're not offensive. And this particular book has focused on Asia, so I think might be worth mentioning. And then the issues about data, because companies like TikTok are arguably the most important short, video companies, and the videos of people use them. And they have created a whole new debate about data and how it is harvested and monopolized and misused and commercial. I think it's also worth mentioning why China is able to do this. Its economic heft, its technological prowess, and its kind of controlled economic system where if the government says we're going to build this in this country within this period, it will be no NGOs, no legal issues, no, all that which affects democratic societies don't seem to bother authorities. It's much quicker, therefore more efficient. Okay, good. Sorry. So I'll just repeat that just in case. So in 1995, China accounted for less than 5% of global share of manufacturing. In 2023, it was nearly 32%. And there is corresponding decline in the United States from nearly 24% to 15%. Japan declined. Germany declined. India, it's a little big. South Africa, but relative to China, very small. But you can see an interesting trend. The growth is not happening in the traditional power centers. The pivot to Asia, which Mr. Obama spoke some years ago, seems to be happening, maybe not clearly, but if you look carefully, something interesting. Also, in terms of, I talked about energy earlier, in terms of alternative energy, which is fundamental for the new kind of digital world we're living in. AI is going to get even more complicated. As you see on this diagram, this chart, China is ahead of everybody else by some margin. It hasn't just happened like that. It's been very systematic and very planned investment and support, and you see the results. Just more than rest of the world combined almost. Add to that, you have extraordinary success in digital infrastructure. So China is already home to some of the most sophisticated satellite technology in the world. Although it's a latecomer. Remember, satellite technology was the US versus Soviet Union. Europe came much later. China was really laggard in it. But today, satellites are very important, and they're particularly significant in the global south, where they get to be used because they're relatively cheaper. And with 6G, which is now not uncommon in China, it's not like 5G, but there are many parts of Europe where 5G doesn't operate. I don't know about how good it is in Brazil, but in many parts of the world, 5G isn't operated properly. They're on to 6G. So in the digital domain too, they have a huge advantage. And that has a direct connection with the changing geopolitics because everything is moving in that domain. But China's focus has been on, although it's very, as a trading partner for almost every major economy in the world, it is the biggest trading nation on the planet. And its biggest trading partner is the United States, despite all the tariff wars one years ago. And Brazil and Germany and Russia, India, all the big economies are, part of its trading kind of partners. But its focus, at least in theory, is on the global south. It still calls itself a developing country. Which is true if you look at the GDP per capita. It's a huge country, so per capita will never be as big as a small European country. Like Denmark has 4 million people, which is population of a portion of a big Chinese city. So with all these new technologies that they have developed and are developing, they focus on the global south because that's where the growth is. This data is from ITU, it's a government UN data, so it can be slightly slow to behind corporate data, but you can get this sense that there are still a lot of people on this planet who do not have internet access. 60% have, 40% don't have. And there then BRI becomes very important because BRI has this very important digital element in it. And the focus is on the global south. Add to that is what's happening in the realm of artificial intelligence. I referred to you at the beginning of my talk, but you see what China is doing in that department. The United Nations talks about a global AI divide. And this is a UN report, recent one, which in the typical UN speak says that all AI governance is crucial, not merely to address the challenges and risks, but also to ensure that we harness AI's potential in ways that leave no one behind. It's typical UN. Doesn't mean anything. But it's standard practice. Bureaucrats write them, and they're like all the edges are sort of softened to make it a non-statement. But the idea of divide is important. Although, the digital divide, which became quite a sexy term, was originally stolen from a report which was published by US government bodies, American widely. But the divide exists. Much of the world doesn't know what AI is, right? Let alone having its own corporations and companies developing AI, infrastructure or platforms. Here again, China has a very important role. I call it affordable AI for the global south. So this was a cover story recently on The Economist magazine. China's lean, mean AI machine. And then you would remember it was this moment, the so-called DeepSeek moment. It shocked the AI world. Why? Because they were able to produce something which was much, much cheaper than what the going rate was in California. So this, you may know this, it became viral. Microsoft said, we are good for $80 billion. Meta said, we are good for our $65 billion. DeepSeek, we are good for our $5.5 million. So if you are an AI startup in Bangladesh or Peru or Mozambique, who are you going to approach? No wonder there's an AI with Cold War going on now. And also a very interesting reversal of how geopolitics of AI works. The big American companies are less open to share their software with other countries than this very closed political system in China. DeepSeek is more liberal in that sense. The long-term plan, okay, let's give it to people for free and then they will be dependent on us. Fascinating. But the debate about this is, again, in a very stark, probably Western way of looking at either or, with us or against us. You need this binary to make an argument for most people who are really not interested. And AI too is kind of framed in this democratic versus authoritarian AI. So democratic is what is based in California, and if Russians or the Chinese or someone else is doing it, that is authoritarian. And this is kind of not just coming from the kind of policy networks, policy discourse, think tanks, etc., but also in the mainstream elite media. So, for example, this was a Freedom House report some years ago, suggesting what AI will do to advance internet freedom. So freedom is the key word, and this is a new technology to further enhance freedom, protect freedom. As against this report from another US-based, very powerful NGO, activist, advocacy, whatever you want to call it, which has got very bad treatment from Mr. Trump administration, National Endowment for Democracy. This report says manufacturing deceit, how generative AI supercharges information manipulation. And the assumption is done by the other party. We don't do that. This is one of many such examples. There's actually a mini discourse going on about AI versus as an authoritarian versus democratic agent. Now, the reason I'm mentioning DeepSeek is really this whole southern focus, which China explicitly follows, claims that we are a developing country. It's not true. but it projects itself as the leader of the global south. And to some extent, there is an argument for saying that China has emerged from a developing country into it's now called an emerged power, and it's not an emerging power. So, at the heart of it, in my view, is the developmental issue. And development with Chinese characteristics, as one scholar called it. So what are these characteristics? It's a recent book which was published in the US, and it's a very interesting summation of how China has created an alternative model of development and why it is attractive to many parts of the global south. China's chance to lead, acquiring global influence via infrastructure development, digital and digitalization. Both things are efficacious in detailing. So what are these characteristics? State-led development. So the development discourse in the West is NGO-centered. It's the whole aid industry. They will go and they will go to a slum in Mumbai or a slum in Rio or a slum in Kenya, and we'll give some widows some laptops and then a camera crew will follow. And then we say, look, we are helping these communities, the dispossessed people, exploited people, etc., etc. As against the Chinese approach, which is that, okay, we're going to give you a rail line, or we're going to give you a satellite connection, or a broadband connection. But the condition is that you have to show our television news, you have to show our historical dramas. There's no free lunch. But it's more effective because it's being done with a structural change, not the superficial made for climate change. And if you are sitting in one of those slums, then you would know which side to go to, because you see that there's actually running water in your tap. And China has a very proud, I would say, God of eliminating extreme poverty. Example, indeed. A generation ago, China had the largest number of people living in extreme poverty in the world. I'm Indian. India also has a lot of people in extreme poverty. India has done extremely well. The number of people living in extreme poverty now is a single digit. Not long ago, it was 40%. But China has done much better. In 2020, it officially declared that extreme poverty has been eliminated. And because the numbers were so huge that it has affected the UN data on how many people are in extreme poverty on the planet. India has also contributed, but these are two very, very big populated countries. Robust digital hardware, supply chains, and powerful supply. I've already referred to it, but it's a very important point. We've seen that the supply chains issue in the recent geopolitical discussion since February this year. People have discovered where do things come from? What is the connection? How these supply lines work? And what happens if you stop that? Global South is priority, although the big markets are still in Western Europe, Japan, and in the United States. But if you have a long-term plan, which I think the Chinese have, the priority is the global south, because that's where the growth is going to be. And because what we have done in BRI being one example, is that it's really basically threatened this whole system of NGO-based aid, plus the third world, now to global south. And a new kind of Cold War has started because of that. Because remember, some of you with older memories will remember the Cold War, aid was a very important part of geopolitics. Aid is very political subject. And now there's a major player on, has been for the last decade on that. And with what Mr. Trump has done to US aid, to other American foundations, specifically looking at the developing world, it is even more of a chance for China to expand its reach. And of course, for Europeans, Germans especially, there are a lot of foundations, they do they call German foreign policy, NGO foreign policy. They are very concerned that their influence is waning. French influence in France, in Africa, for example, very well done. So no wonder China is seen as a systemic competitor and rival. Not my words, this is an EU description. Systemic rival. One US think tank summarized the problem very neatly, and I will share that with you. Why China is that systemic rival? Unlike the Soviet Union in the 1950s and 60s and Japan in the 1970s and 80s, China is pursuing global leadership along all 4 dimensions. Biggest supplier, largest market, main geopolitical rival, toughest competitor. China has lifted more people out of poverty faster than any society in human history, while differing sharply from established Western norms. I indicated earlier about state-led development, etc. So there is a fundamental challenge, because Western nations have been trying to remove poverty for the last 60, 70, 80 years. You would argue poverty has grown, inequality has grown. So people are saying, okay, let's go to another model of change, with all its attendant problems and complications coming from a one-party state. Add to that mix, and I'm coming towards the end of my talk, is the Trump effect, which has affected virtually every aspect of contemporary life, and certainly geopolitics. This is how Time magazine had put it on cover. One of the cover magazines, this was covered on, and when was it? In February, when he got elected second time. He's back and he's going to sweep everything up. And for once, Time editors were right. That's exactly what he has done. I mean, I'm in my 60s, and I don't remember anything as disruptive coming out of a democratically elected president of the most powerful nation in the planet. And forget about the vulgarity and the banality and the insane statements he made, which is unbecoming of the president. But the actions, forget about decorum of what you expect from a senior statesman. It's just the disruption is extraordinary. It's not even a year yet. And it's not just with the adversaries. It's friend and foe alike. And we've seen this most prominently in the way global trade talks are conducted. This was by Foreign Affairs cover story, basically. The weaponized world now. And again, China is an important example here because China is the only major country where US had to take a step back. It's too important to be delinked, right? So, how do we deal with this emerging, still very disruptive new geopolitics? Again, I'm borrowing this rather interesting covers illustration, foreign affairs, and this was in relation to what Mr. Trump was doing vis-a-vis Europeans. Who needs allies? And India was supposed to be good ally, but you see the 50% tariff, the highest in the world, and Brazil too, very high tariff. So is it then creating a weakening of transatlantic alliance? Is the West going to be weakened because there is this maverick leader? An argument was made about the Ukraine invasion by Russia that is united the West. Now, there's a reverse argument being made, is that if this continues, it's bad for Europe, but it's not bad for America. They're actually benefiting from it. So let them be busy with it. So again, weakening transatlantic, apart from the defense companies, they do not play out of this. Competing platform imperialisms. I started with talking about this cloud empires and data imperialism. The platforms are also very, very powerful means of controlling discourse. And now you have this other set of platforms, the Alibabas of the world and 10 cents of the world, and these are not just confined to the territorial space of China. They are increasingly global, particularly in the global south. Chinese smartphones are everywhere. They're cheaper and they're more effective. So, with mobile internet and satellites and the things I mentioned earlier, there is a debate about what kind of this authoritarian one-party state, that model is being exported and what that means to the future of democracy and debate, etc. Digital Cold War and weaponization of information. I talked about that in relation to trade. But if you look at the Ukraine case, weaponization of information is a fantastic case of how to manipulate information. In fact, in my book, there is a whole chapter about weaponization of information with Ukraine as a case study. At the same time, you have these alternative structures. BRICS Plus, I already mentioned, BRI, I already mentioned, SCI, I indicated. These are real institutions. Of course, there are lots of problems. They're not by any chance, by any reckoning, as coherent as you might say G7 is, although how coherent G7 is also debatable. But they are, as I said, in the case of BRICS, they are growing rather than shrinking. And then that leads to my final point, and there's one more slide after this, which is what I've said in terms of the continuities and changes that we experience. Are we not then to think about de-Americanizing this whole debate? Not only how it's framed, but also how it is digitized, how it is communicated. Because increasingly there is a lot of information now available from non-American sources. And the idea that everything emanates from one country is becoming increasingly problematic to sustain. In this age of 24/7 connectivity and this whole digital revolution that I indicate. And the idea of a multipolar world, because when the Cold War ended, it was proclaimed from rooftops that this is it, history is ended, capitalism is won, etc., etc., and there's a unipolar world. Of course, with any sense of history, people realize that that is not true. The book End of History has so many holes in it, you could drive a truck through it. Basic holes, basic information is missing. But that's a different discussion. The point is that the world is moving towards a multipolar world, and so China might be a pole in that, but there is also Russia. People realize after 2023 that this is a serious country, you can't mess with it. It is sitting with one of the biggest nuclear arsenals, the energy empire, is a lot of very educated, people. It's not a kind of oligarch country which most sort of Western media frame it as a mafia state. So Russia, we're here and we are serious and take us seriously. And in European capitals, certainly that's happened. India, another major country, if the predictions are correct, Goldman Sachs to the World Bank is saying that it will be the third largest economy by 2027 in GDP terms, which is not very far. Again, very distinct culture, very different approaches from China, the largest democracy, multicultural, multilingual, etc., largest populated country. The middle class in India is bigger than the combined population of the United States and Western Europe, and Russia, and Japan. So, if you think of this in terms of China, Russia, India, and then what I mentioned earlier about expansion of BRICS, there is an argument to be made, and I think it will be relevant for students who are studying Asia, and studying it from a different continent, is to what I said earlier to think about what Obama said, that the pivot is shifting to Asia. And you could argue that in the 1990s, okay, that was like celebrating the Cold War victory. In the first decade of the 21st century, the obsession was with terrorism. And they forgot the big story, which was the rise of Asia. And they woke up to it when it was already a bit late. The other argument I'm end with that is also the fact that, again, this argument put forward by some people in Asia, especially about the return of Asia, not the rise of Asia, which is a very different way of looking at it. Because anybody with basic understanding of world history will tell you that until the 18th century, more than 45% of global GDP came from Asia. China was leading it, India was second. So if these countries are now rising 300 years later, it's not a sudden kind of odd thing. There's a whole history behind it. And again, predictions can go wrong, but here is one, the GDP in 2030 in terms of purchasing power parity, which arguably is more accurate description of the power of a particular economy. This is not very far now, we're already end of 25. So China, India, US, Indonesia, Turkey, Brazil, Egypt, Russia, Japan, Germany. Somebody should tell my friends in Paris and London that we're out of it. They still think they rule the world. And the world has changed. And a very good description of that is in this book, not written by an academic, but somebody who's actually into various fields, think tanks and corporate world, and travels the world, knows the world. And it says it all. The future is Asian, like it or not. That positive note, I'll stop the lecture, and I'm happy to take questions or comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Daya. Sorry. Now I give the floor for Professor Pedro, who is going to act as the discussant today.
Thank you, Professor Alana. Thank you very much. It's very pleasant to meet you again, Professor Daya Thussu. I remember we met about 10 years ago when he came to Brazil, to Rio, for the Intercom Communication Research Conference. And it's very pleasant to be talking to you again. And I'm honored for the invitation. Thanks everyone at the Lab Asia team. And I must say, Professor Thussu, I'm very eager to read your new book, because this has been such a fascinating glimpse of the ideas that you have put in there. So this is a very tough task to comment on everything. So I must start by saying that Professor Thussu's work is extremely influential in the field of geopolitics of communication, or international communication, or sometimes referred to as global media studies. But when I teach this elective course called Geopolitics of Communication in my university, I always recommend my students to read Dr. Thussu's books and chapters as part of the mandatory bibliography, together with the works of Dr. Oliver Boyd Barrett, with whom Dr. Thussu has published some of their most memorable books, including Counterflow in Global News, which was, as far as I can remember, the first time I read something about the international flow of news coming from the global south and being circulated worldwide in the opposite direction of what we were used to since the 19th century. There were news and information and cultural goods coming from Western Europe and North America, and later Japan, to what was then called the Third World, and then today the Global South. And also, I need to mention that these some pioneers in the study of these, besides some American authors that were very connected to the US government establishment of international organizations, like Ithiel de Solopoul, like Wilbur Schramm, Daniel Lerner. They were already studying international communications back in the 1950s and 60s. But then later, in the 60s and 70s, came another generation of scholars who are more connected to Marxist ideas and the political economy of international communications, like the recently deceased Armand Matlar from Belgium, Jeremy Tunstall, Annabelle Sobrany, Ali Mohammadi, Carl Nordenström, also a co-author of Dr. Thussu in many books, Tapio Vares, and so many others, including a whole Latin American tradition of the studies of geopolitics of communication, like Eleazar Diaz Rengel from Venezuela, Fernando Reyes Mata and Juan Somavia from Chile, Rafael Roncaliolo from Peru, and many of these authors, when they were writing about 50 years ago, they were looking mostly at the dynamics of international journalism as probably the easiest to document or easiest to measure form of international information flows. Back then, it looked easier to measure these from the news than from cultural products like movies or TV series or books or comic books. Although Matelar and Ariel Dorfman wrote a groundbreaking study on Disney comics called How to Read Donald Duck in 1972, I believe. But then came the study by Jeremy Tunstall in 1977 called The Media Are American, in which he documented how much of the structures for spreading media and global communications, including cultural products, including the cultural industries, came from the United States. He was not talking about Hollywood, but also the music industry, the radio distribution, and yes, television, not only drama series, but also documentary news series. But then he revised the same research 30 years later in another book called The Media Were American. They no longer are, but they were American, which came out in 2008 when he started bringing light to other international flows of media products. For example, like the soap operas from Brazil and Turkey, or the TV dramas from South Korea. Even drama was not a thing back then, but he was already paying attention to this kind of trend. Or different TV stations, news channels like Al Jazeera or Telesur from Latin America. And this was important. This was starting to rise back then, but people were not paying attention to China at that time. Probably it was not after 2010 that the comeback of China to the global stage became more evident. And yes, of course, like Dr. Thussu just said, this also became it was followed, or maybe not followed in the sense of precedence, but it was joined by a larger presence in international media. And we're not only referring to the news channels like CGTN, which was then called CCTV, that is available not only in English, but also in Spanish and French, not French to France, but French to Africa, most of all, and Arabic. But also the social media that came afterwards. So the people are now more familiar than ever with brands like Baidu, Alibaba, Weibo, QQ, WeChat. Recently, this crusade against TikTok in the United States made people familiar with the Little Red Book app and the Douyin, which is the mainland China version of TikTok, and so people are starting to become acquainted and use and integrate with this market in a way that counters the previous trend. It was that the major big tech companies and platforms were pulling out from China, like Google and Spotify. So now you're seeing more digital companies and media companies from China coming into the so-called Western markets, including not only the global North, Western Europe and Japan and North America, but also Latin America, Africa, and Asia, and Oceania, or they call in English the Pacific. And this is an unprecedented trend, which is, of course, and I fully agree with Dr. Thussu, that this is a symptom not of a rise of Asia or a rise of China, but actually as a comeback. Because if we, he said it very well, but if we study authors like Oh my God, I forgot his name.
Mehbubani, Kishore Mehbubani?
No, I meant the Italian. Sorry, I should have taken notes before this. Arrighi, that's what I meant.
Okay.
Giovanni Arrighi. So we can all be aware that China was there since the dawn of mankind. So since the early centuries of the human species or early millennia, the area we now call China has always been a demographic cluster. Back in the day when Europe was populated only by Neanderthals, and yes, what happened in China was a century of hiatus, a century of humiliation, as they call it, between the Opium War in the 19th century and the Chinese Revolution in the 20th century. But even when it comes to India, we can say the same. So India and China and everything in between, like the Southeast Asia, have always been the most of humanity, most of the GDP, most of the invention, and we may say even in media, even in communications. I think it suffices to say that the paper, printing, the ink, the black ink, the newspaper, all of these came from Asia, many of them particularly from China. And so yes, before the Industrial Revolution in Europe, the gravity center of the world was in East Asia and South Asia. And what we're witnessing now, it's sort of a natural rearrangement of international economy, including international communication, pushing this gravity center back to where it was for most of its history. Now, I would like to recall that very recently, this year, in June 2025, there was this BRICS summit here in Rio de Janeiro. And a few days later, not before that, but later, there was a BRICS media forum, media and think tank forum, also in Rio, and it was organized by Xinhua. Xinhua used to be the national news agency of China, but now it's much more than that. Now it's the largest media conglomerate, not only in China, but in the world. It is a behemoth, it's colossal, and it is, by many criteria, including number of employees and employed journalists, the largest news organization on the planet, larger than Reuters, larger than the BBC, larger than CNN by far. And it brought many different institutions here to Rio to discuss the forging of new structures and new possibilities of a global media that is not controlled by the handful of media giants from the West. And there were many news agencies and news agency managers from the global South there, like Bernama from Malaysia, Nan from Nigeria, Andina from Peru, Antara from Indonesia, Prensa Latina from Cuba, not to mention TASS and Sputnik from Russia. And all these people were there in a way, in a fashion that was very reminiscent of initiatives of South-South cooperation in communication that happened, that were on the rise about 50 years ago in the days of the non-aligned movement. So I would like to ask you some minutes of your attention just to trace back this history, even because some of our students in international relations may not be aware of this. But in 1973, in the Conference of Algiers, in Algeria, just newly independent Algeria in Northern Africa, the non-aligned movement tied back its appeal for a new international economic order to what they would call then the new international information order, and would later be renamed as the new world information and communication order, which was essentially a campaign to restructure global communication, bringing more international regulation, not regulation at national level in each country, but internationally, through organizations part of the UN system, like the ITU, which governs the infrastructure, the telecom structure, like satellites and cable, and the UNESCO, which regulates the software, media, education, science and scientific publication, and all this was led with a very anti-systemic and we can even say anti-capitalist framework of analysis and of ideas, of propositions, which were later moved from the frame of the non-aligned movement into the frame of the UN system. And like Dr. Thussu just said, it's typical UN language to water down all the radical proposals, all the anti-systemic ideas into a vocabulary of consensus. And so everything that was about international regulation became about governance. Everything that was about a balanced flow of information was rooted back to the free flow of information, which is the doctrine of the free market applied to communications since 19th century United States. And all the concepts, the very critical concepts of media imperialism and cultural colonialism, like Matalar, like Boyd Barrett and Tunstall and so many other authors championed back then, was morphed into softer and less critical concepts like, say, digital colonialism and data extractivism and digital rights, or online free speech, or freedom of expression online, which is the official UN phraseology. And so the Global South, or then called Third World, missed a major chance back then, but not only on its own failures, but also because it faced such an intense and coherent opposition from these major players in global communication. Now, back then, the main villain of the day were the news agencies, the major news agencies. So we're talking about Reuters, the Associated Press, the now nearly deceased United Press International. It still exists, but it's a fragment of what it once were. Agence France Presse in France. But nowadays, the villains of the day are the big tech, the tech giants, the GAFAM, five giants: Google, Amazon, Facebook, now Meta, and Alphabet, and I actually said Google and Microsoft, and Apple, of course, the other A's of Apple. But there are more discrete giants. They are still dominant, and I mean those private companies, and some of them are state-owned companies that control the infrastructure, the actual infrastructure, not meaning data centers, but the fiber optic cables that are underwater, the satellites. They're still so important for so many parts of the global traffic of communication. So you cannot build a different order or structure of global communications unless we challenge those players that are still in charge. And what I think is very important, and China is starting to do, is to promote this kind of cooperation that is very different from imperialism. Because even taken from the examples that Dr. Thussu brought, they are promoting something that was very, very asked for in the 1970s, but the Western major companies and governments refused to do, which was technology transfer. They are not only bringing their business in, they are bringing their business and leaving and teaching how to do with things like open source software and capacity building in technological and engineering. And this was something that was very much praised in that BRICS Media Forum this year, because the managers of news agencies and news organizations in the peripheral countries, they were saying Reuters always wanted exclusivity from us in order to give us the privilege of redistributing their content, their news feed internally. Now, Xinhua is not asking exclusivity. They're bringing the computers, they're taking our journalists and technicians to China to study and teach them how to operate the machines, how to operate the software, how to build new softwares, new systems. And this is very, very different from what was done by these major companies, not on, even before the internet and in the first decades of the internet. And I remember that the subject of my master's dissertation 15 years ago was the non-aligned news agencies pool, which was founded 50 years ago, 1975, and was probably the most pragmatic and most successful initiative for South-South cooperation in media and news media back then. And it was led by the news agency that was then part of socialist Yugoslavia called Tanjug, Telegrafska Agencija Nova Yugoslavia. And it had the idea that was inherited from the Yugoslav style of socialism, which was self-management socialism. It had the idea that all cooperation was meant to be made of free association, and all contributors were supposed to give as much as they could give and take as much as they needed, which is a very, very socialist motto in the essence in the days of utopian socialism. And it had to be flexible because the non-aligned countries were at different levels of development. So you had India, you had Indonesia, you had Yugoslavia, which were very advanced. At the same time, you had countries like Liberia, like Zimbabwe, like Papua New Guinea. And these member states, they all needed in different ways, different levels, capacity building, leasing equipment, lowering the tariffs for international telecommunication fees. And so the NANAP was not only an organization for news exchange, a news exchange mechanism, how Dr. Thussu and Dr. Boyd Barrett called in their book, but also they were doing lobby. They were doing political action in international organizations like the ITU, like UNESCO, to push for the interests of the developing countries. Now, why am I referring to this now? Because the BRICS are acting in a very different way. First of all, there's a difference in membership and accession, because just like Dr. Thussu showed, the BRICS are not everyone. They are not yet most of the developing countries of the world. They are mostly the so-called emerging countries, the regional leaders, and countries that have something to offer into a global trade and partnership. While the non-aligned movement at its peak had more than 120 members, and they included not only those mid-level or even high human development index countries like Yugoslavia, but also extremely poor countries, like Haiti, like Bolivia, and like Somalia, and all these countries, like I said, had different levels of demand, of requirements. And so the projects for development had to comprehend that. And the BRICS are also not anti-capitalist in its nature. Although we must say, to be honest, that neither was the non-aligned movement, because it had side by side some socialist countries and very anti-communist countries like Suharto's Indonesia, who had just massacred the communists in Jakarta in 1967. And it also had monarchies like the Ethiopia of Haile Selassie and Iran of the Shah Reza Pahlavi. And Iran stayed in the movement even after the 1979 revolution. So why was that? Why was it so heterogeneous? Because non-alignment has always been pragmatic and has always been about a commitment to bring together all these newly formed countries. Many of them were colonies of Europe or the United States, like Philippines, at some point. And regardless of their form or system of government, they had some shared interests. While the BRICS, may I dare to say so, they are not trying to break the current order. They are trying to better fit into this order, which is a very different attitude and a very different foreign policy for these countries. So what can I bring as examples to that in the field of media and communication? So we must recall that while China has all these companies that I just mentioned, from news organizations to social media, and Russia also has TASS, Sputnik, Vkontakte, and Odnoklassniki, which are two social platforms that are competitors to Facebook, and Telegram, which is a competitor to WhatsApp, and Viber, also a different instant messenger. And India has major media organizations like ABP, Z Media, Jagran, Prakashan, the Hindu Group, Bennett Coleman, and some state-owned companies like Doordarshan, and also has a very important news agency, the PTI, which, if I recall correctly, Dr. Thussu worked for PTI at some point, right? But Brazil and South Africa do not have anything like that. Yes, Brazil has Globo and Record is very important in the Portuguese-speaking countries of Africa, Angola, Mozambique, most of all. And India has Naspers, Sekunjalo, Caxton, which are all private media groups. But none of them are in the same position to offer any opposition to the media giants and tech giants of the global north. There's a colleague of mine who uses to say, when talking about Netflix and Global Play, the streaming platforms of the US and Brazil, he used to say, who is Globo next to Google? Like, just because both of them start with G. Because even the largest media conglomerate in Brazil and Latin America is very small next to one of these digital giants from the United States. So just to finish, where can we look for alternatives? I believe that Dr. Thussu's lecture brought many important ideas on and the way that this development with Chinese characteristics and the Belt and Road Initiative and the way they are pushing for more cooperation and less exploitation can be a way out. But I'm firmly convinced that China, as both a country and a civilization, can only look for these long-term policies. Like he said, this is not overnight. This was designed decades ago and is now materializing as consequences of a long-term policy. China can only push for that because it has adopted socialism. It's not because of Confucianism and other cultural traits of the Chinese culture, but because in socialism, societies are not strangled by the need for profit that drives capitalism, and especially in this unregulated neoliberal free market style of capitalism, and which is leading us to environmental destruction, to a breakdown of societal links, right, and to this the erasure of the ties of between generations and between co-workers, and even in health, like as we have seen in the COVID-19 pandemic, is making what makes us human fall apart. So it's hard to see in this context how more capitalism could provide answers. Perhaps the time has come to look for new ideas elsewhere, and maybe China and Asia in the long term can provide us with some of these answers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Pedro. So now I think that all the remarks were very thought and provoking, right? So I would like to confirm whether Professor Daya Thussu would like to reply to Professor Pedro, or maybe to pose some other issues to Professor Pedro, or if we also opens to other questions from the students and the audience here. So please feel free to...
I'll very briefly respond, because what Pedro said was so comprehensive and so detailed. Just make a few points, which is that I was actually very directly involved with the non-aligned news agencies pool. I used to sit on the desk in Press Trust of India, which was a very important partner of that organization. The problem was that much of the non-aligned countries did not have a professional news setup. So it was, if you these were the days of Iran-Iraq war. So if you're looking at the Iranian news agency copy and the Iraqi news agency copies, they were so partisan, you ended up using Reuters. So let's not undermine the professionalism and sophistication of these transnational media organizations. They do things very well. That's why they dominate. And the so-called global South has to raise its bar. So you mentioned Xinhua being the biggest news organization in the world. But just tell me, when did Xinhua break an international news story, which Reuters does every month? So it's a structural problem in the case of China, that the system is so controlled by the state. There's very little space for any kind of political discourse. And therefore it becomes like the UN documents, it becomes very blind. And it doesn't. So China has a real problem in terms of communicating its story to the world. The final thing I would say that in relation to BRICS is that when the project I was involved in for 4 years one of the things we found most striking was how little intra-BRICS exchange actually takes place. Right. So if you ask an average person on the streets in Kolkata or Mumbai what they know about Brazil, they probably will talk about football. They might have seen a soap opera somewhere. That's it. They will know this is one of the most important countries on the planet. It's the most important country, certainly in South America. It has a very interesting history. It's a, kind of discourse about, for example, digital rights and, a kind of model of internet, which is very interesting. The whole debate about, dependency theory, Latin American contribution is substantial. Liberation theology and what that does to people. Again, these ideas have come from that part of the world. So I think that was one, because the structure is vertical, and what non-aligned people were arguing, the leadership was arguing, was it should be horizontal. And one final thought on that is that you mentioned a lot of people who were involved in that. I would add that the organization of which I am the president currently, the IAMCR, was directly involved in those debates in the 1970s. People like Herbert Schiller, they were fundamental to the way this debate was shaped. And at its core, it was a debate about fair and equal and just order. In fact, in the recent, this BRICS book I mentioned, the last book, I have a chapter I call NOACO 2.0, BRICS Building NOACO 2.0, and I talk about how much the internet has, changed that debate about news flow. That was a very narrow debate about news agencies, and as you said, in today's world, it's much more complicated. So I think we have to have a little balanced view. It is not that I was saying all the right things about China, and I stand by that, but China also has real issues about how to communicate in a world where there are better storytellers. They've been doing it for longer and they are much more professional. There's not just resources, it's also that capacity to tell you a story effectively.
Thank you very much, Professor Daya. Right now, I think that we can open the floor to questions, and I would like to give the students and the audience here the opportunity to participate. I see that we have some questions already in the chat. However, I would like to ask if someone would like to pose the question directly to Professor Daya Thussu.
Can I respond to Anna Helena's question about Brazil? Sure. I sort of responded to that in response to Pedro's comments that Brazil has, is associated in outside Brazil as a kind of entertainment world, and it is very good at that. Brazil is so popular, it's been circulating in the world for a long time, and of course soccer is big. But in the news and sort of non-fiction category, still has lots to do. Although I would argue that there is much more in recent, again, it all depends, it's also implied in the question, it also depends on the political dispensation. So currently there is a different president, a different kind of debate. A few years back, it was an entirely different, almost a polar opposite of what the current president is saying. So, and that's the problem of democracies. Right? China, they don't have it. There's one party and they can follow that for 10, 20, 50 years. But I feel that Brazil has a huge contribution to make because it is a very interesting case. It is if you think in intellectual terms, it's a Western nation. The Portuguese king went out there, and it's a kind of transfer of power from Europe to Portugal to Latin America, and it's actually the elite is European. What makes China and India different is that they are a different civilizational powers, and their rise means a very different kind of worldview. I think that's some point that many of us don't make, but it's a very important point. So China is such a different history and culture, and so is India. It's civilizational power. And that's a very different way of thinking about the world. Brazil has, it's like, as they say, it's the country of tomorrow, right? It's got huge future, but actually in comparison to many other members of the BRICS country, I would say Brazil is doing very well, although like India, it has a big problem of disparity between rich and poor. But in terms of its media power, I would say it's very limited, except in entertainment field. You could also say something similar about India, which is even bigger an irony because India has a huge advantage of English language. Times of India was established in 1838. There are 10 generations of people who work in English language, which is the language of human communication. It's a very lively debating culture. It's a democracy, so people know how to argue or disagree with anybody. But the Indian news media are almost absent in the global space. Partly because, unlike China, it doesn't have this project to take over the world, but partly it's apathy, partly it's indifference, but it doesn't figure very much. Okay, so we have hands up. So should we take question from Maria Joyce, who wants to go first?
Yes, please. I think Maria, right?
Unmute and ask.
So thank you so much, Professor, for the lecture. It was amazing. It was very enlightening. Well, and it was very productive as well. And considering the perspective you presenting during the lecture, I would like to ask how the implications of what you've called the Americanization of global geopolitics and the accelerating shift of economic power forward Asia, such as the forecast of Asia share in the global GDP for 2030, how that may suggest the formation of a genuinely new multipolar digital order, or we are witnessing the emergence of a competing tech blocks that may just reinforce old forms of inequality and dependency, especially in the global south. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Very good question. Actually, there is an inbuilt assumption that the expansion of an alternative system or creation of an alternative system would be necessarily exploitative. If you look at Chinese history, it's interesting. You don't see a lot of cases of Chinese colonization. They've done lots of bad things to their own people, but they haven't actually gone around the world and invaded countries, which the United States does every month now, waiting to get into Venezuela. So I don't think it's necessarily the case that the rise of Asia will lead to a new kind of exploitation. Some of that will certainly happen because of a power game, and power will be exploited to gain, and China is no exception, or any other country tomorrow will get that position. It will use that power. But I think it's not necessarily the case that it will be the only course of action. And so far, I don't think there is a very clear indication it's going that way. In fact, maybe it's the long-run project. In 20 years' time, we'll see a more exploitative phase of it. But in terms of also what you said about the rise of Asia, it may all go horribly wrong. Nobody knows, right? We can't. These predictions are made on certain parameters applicable at certain time. There was a time, and you probably remember, in your part of the world, when Argentina was one of the richest countries in the world, right? That isn't the case today. So things can change. But I do believe that the foundations are such that this prediction that the power will shift is actually very likely, not certain. And we'll see how that then changes the global order. I think the final point I would say that this idea that somehow there's a center, as I used that word, multipolarity has become very, very popular these days. I think that's the way to balance the world. And it's like going back to the 19th century idea of balance of power. And in that pole, there will be European Union will be an important pole, Russia will be an important pole, and parts of Asia will be. And of course, Brazil and Nigeria and Turkey and Indonesia. This is a much more complex world and perhaps much more democratic world because of this.
Professor Daya, thank you so much for your lecture. Was very insightful for us. I have one question about how do you analyze the role of social media in the rise of the far right and the fascist politicians and the spread of a broad agenda and very generic one, and the lack of the leadership in the protests, especially those centered on Generation Z. In Asia, we saw the case of Myanmar. How do you analyze this scenario?
I have to admit, I am not on social media because I think it's toxic, and I'm still kind of surviving with the English. But I studied because it's a very important instrument for influence. And as you mentioned, in recent years, it has been weaponized to the extent that it has led to regime change in Asia, for example. We have seen that in Nepal, we've seen that in Bangladesh, we've seen Sri Lanka, in that South Asian region, and Myanmar. In the first three cases, there was actually a regime change. The question that you should be asking, who benefits from it? Is this just teenagers who just go out there and the regime is changed, or is there something else behind that? Somebody is backing them, there is a platform, there is a funding structures, etc. And in both in these three cases, there is an external involvement for geopolitical reasons. So I would take it with a bit of skepticism. In fact, it's the chapter I have in the book about, I call it digital empowerment versus digital imperialism, because there's a lot of discussion about empowerment, because that suits the neoliberal idea that we all, with a few emails and few social media posts, can be activists. And the generation is growing up with that without having any context or background of what they are fighting for. And then that is exploited by various corporates or governments or vested interests in a particular context. The other thing you said about this polarization, and that is obviously the case and most pronounced one in the United States, but some version of that in most countries, your country included. But just think of the absurdity of it, that the President of the United States has his own social media platform. I can't recall in modern history any other leader having his own platform, right? And then he could write very bad English with a lot of capital letters and make statements about global affairs. Some of these not properly researched or being not accurate. So it starts this kind of partisan and bipolar, sort of, contested and bipolar kind of conversation is not only toxic, but also incredibly unhelpful to any kind of decent debate and discussion. As a result, what's happening is the debate is constantly defiled and debased. And the current occupant of the White House is really the master of art doing that. But some version of that you see in many other contexts. And not just in democratic society. Social media in China is full of a lot of quite critical and sometimes quite kind of over-the-top, demonization. In the most recent case is the demonization of Japanese Prime Minister. That's what she said about Taiwan. So this is a kind of instrument that powerful people use, whether it's Generation Z or it is Trump's MAGA people. And it's a very significant part of contemporary international relations because it's being used by, so for example, it's not unusual for Chinese politicians and spokespeople using Twitter, now X, to talk to the world when Twitter or X is banned in China. Or it's not unusual for Western ambassadors and commentators using Chinese networks translated into Mandarin for that audience. So it's got various levels, whether it's the governmental, corporate, or just influencer industry. And I shouldn't sound very negative. A lot of it is also positive in the sense of people getting jobs and getting engagement, So, but in terms of politics of it, I do feel that it is, overall, my comment would be it is, in my view, debasing the public discourse. And the space within the public sphere within which public opinion is shaped, that has, in my view, become very antagonistic and therefore unhelpful for unhealthy discussion.
Thank you very much, Professor Daya Thussu. Thank you very much also for the audience, for the questions. Well, I think that because of the time, I think that we can call it a day, right? So thank you. I would like to thank again Professor Daya Thussu and also Professor Pedro Aguiar for your valuable contributions for the discussion here today. I do hope that we can continue these discussions in the future. And maybe in Brazil, I don't know, Professor Daya, consider yourself warmly invited to return to Brazil. We would be very happy to have you here at Federal University of Rio de Janeiro or State University of Rio de Janeiro. And I also believe that Fluminense Federal University of Rio de Janeiro too. So thank you very much for your lecture. And I do hope that we can extend these discussions in the future, right? So I think that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me. And bye-bye. It's good night for me. It's good morning for you. Bye-bye.